At 36,000 feet above the frozen Gulf of Alaska, alarms screamed through the Boeing 737. The first officer lay unconscious in the galley. The captain was slumped over the yoke. 300 souls were plunging toward jagged mountains, and only a whisper from Seat 3D could save them. Flight 182 was supposed to be a routine re-dive from Seattle to Anchorage. For Major Celine Jenkins, it was merely a metal tube shuttling her back to Illendorf Air Force Base after a rare 2-week leave. Celine was a combat pilot. She spent her days strapped into the cockpit of an F-22 Raptor, pulling 9 Gs over the Pacific, dogfighting invisible adversaries at supersonic speeds. Commercial flying always bored her. It was too quiet, too passive, too dependent on the 2 men sitting behind the reinforced cockpit door. She sat in Seat 3D, nursing a lukewarm black coffee, watching the weather radar on her tablet. Outside, a brutal winter squall was hammering the Alaskan coastline. The Boeing 737-800 was taking a beating, shuddering violently as it chewed through the turbulent crosswinds. The cabin was dark, mostly silent, save for the rhythmic rattling of the overhead bins and the occasional nervous cough from a passenger. At 2:14 a.m., the first domino fell. The reinforced cockpit door clicked open. First Officer Brian Reynolds stepped out into the forward galley. Even in the dim cabin lighting, Celine noticed something was profoundly wrong. Brian wasn't heading to the lavatory with the usual practiced nonchalance of an airline pilot. He was stumbling. His skin had a terrifying translucent gray pallor, and he was drenched in sweat. He clutched the bulkhead with a trembling hand, his chest heaving as if he had just run a marathon at high altitude. Celine instinctively unbuckled her seatbelt. Her military training had hardwired her to recognize physiological distress. Before the lead flight attendant, Jessica, could even ask if he was all right, Brian's eyes rolled back, his knees buckled, and he collapsed onto the galley floor with a heavy, sickening thud. The cabin erupted. The passengers in row 1 gasped, pressing themselves back into their seats. Jessica dropped her service tray, the plastic cups clattering loudly, and dropped to her knees beside the fallen pilot. "Brian! Brian!" Jessica shouted, her voice laced with rising panic. She pressed 2 fingers to his neck, desperately searching for a pulse. She grabbed the public address microphone, her hand shaking. "Ladies and gentlemen, if there is a medical professional on board, please ring your call button immediately. We have a medical emergency in the forward cabin." Celine was already on her feet, moving into the cramped galley. "I'm not a doctor," she said, her voice carrying the calm, authoritative clip of a combat officer. "But I'm combat lifesaver certified. What are his vitals?" "His pulse is thready. He's barely breathing," Jessica stammered, looking up at Celine with terrified eyes. He just dropped." A passenger from row 12, a retired paramedic named Thomas, rushed forward, pushing past the curtain. He immediately took over, tilting Brian's head back to open his airway. Celine stood up, her instincts screaming that the situation was far from stabilized. "Jessica," Celine said, pointing to the cockpit door, "call the captain. Tell him what's happening." Jessica nodded frantically. She picked up the interphone and punched in the 2-digit code for the flight deck. She held the receiver to her ear. 10 seconds passed. Nothing. Jessica tried again, hitting the buttons harder. She waited. Her knuckles turned white. "He's not answering," she whispered, the panic in her eyes metastasizing into sheer terror. "Captain Miller isn't answering. Try the emergency access code," Celine commanded. Jessica's fingers trembled as she entered the emergency keypad sequence. A small light on the pad blinked amber, initiating the 30-second countdown. Under normal circumstances, the captain could deny entry, keeping the door locked. If he was incapacitated, the door would unlock automatically when the timer expired. The silence in the galley was deafening, broken only by the violent shaking of the aircraft and the ragged, shallow breathing of the first officer on the floor. 20 seconds. Celine felt a sudden, subtle shift in the aircraft's attitude. As an F-22 pilot, she flew by the seat of her pants. Her inner ear was acutely tuned to the physics of flight. The nose was dropping. The plane was banking slightly to the left. It was a microscopic deviation, but at 36,000 feet, flying blindly through a storm, it was a death sentence waiting to happen. 10 seconds. Why isn't he denying it? Jessica cried, tears welling in her eyes. Why isn't Captain Miller denying the code? 0. The lock clicked with a loud metallic snap. The green light illuminated. Celine didn't wait for the flight attendant. She grabbed the handle and shoved the heavy reinforced door open. A wave of heat and a strange acrid smell hit her instantly. It smelled like burning plastic and hot oil. Inside the cramped, dimly lit flight deck, chaos reigned in absolute silence. Captain Owen Miller was not flying the plane. He was slumped forward, his entire upper body weight pressed heavily against the control column. His oxygen mask dangled uselessly by his side. Suddenly, a loud, piercing alarm shattered the air. Beep, beep, beep. A mechanical, dispassionate voice echoed through the cockpit. Autopilot disconnect. Because Captain Miller's unconscious weight was pressing asymmetrically on the yoke, the Boeing's computers registered the heavy manual input and disengaged the autopilot. The aircraft was now entirely in the hands of an unconscious man. The nose pitched down sharply. The artificial horizon on the primary flight display tilted hard left. Flight 182 was rolling into a graveyard spiral, plunging toward the unforgiving ice of the Alaskan wilderness. "Get him off the yoke!" Celine screamed over the blaring master caution alarms. She dove into the cramped space between the two pilot seats. The cockpit of a 737 is notoriously tight, a claustrophobic box of switches, levers, and glowing screens. Maneuvering around the massive center pedestal was nearly impossible. "Thomas, I need you in here now," Celine yelled over her shoulder. The retired paramedic squeezed through the door, his eyes going wide at the sight of the slumped captain and the rapidly spinning Olympter. The numbers were blurring as they bled altitude. "Wubai, grab his shoulders on 3, Celine ordered, wedging her knee against the center console for leverage. She reached across the captain's unconscious body, her hands desperately trying to find purchase on the heavy wool of his uniform. 1, 2, 3 pulled together. They heaved. Captain Miller was a large man, easily 220 pounds of dead weight. As they pulled him back, his chest caught on the yoke, violently jerking the control column backward. The aircraft pitched up aggressively, throwing everyone in the cabin violently into their seats. The engines roared in protest as the angle of attack spiked. "Get him out of the seat, slide him back." Thomas dragged the captain by his armpits, hauling him onto the narrow floor space just outside the cockpit door. Celine didn't hesitate. She threw herself into the left seat, the captain's seat. It was a fundamentally different universe than her F-22. The Raptor had a center stick designed for microscopic hyper-responsive wrist movements. The 737 had a massive yoke, a heavy hydraulic beast that required 2 hands and sheer physical force to muscle around, especially at high speeds. She grabbed the yoke with both hands. The resistance was immense. The aerodynamic forces, screaming over the wings at 450 miles per hour, were fighting her. The plane was banked 45 degrees to the left, the nose dropping precipitously. "Come on, you heavy bastard," Celine gritted through her teeth. She planted her boots on the rudder pedals and pulled back on the yoke, simultaneously twisting it hard to the right. The 737 groaned. The metal airframe shuddered under the immense loing. For 3 agonizing seconds, the plane didn't respond, continuing its lethal dive through the black churning clouds. Then, agonizingly, the horizon line on the digital display began to level out. The altimeter slowed its frantic downward spin, halting at 28,400 feet. Celine leveled the wings and eased the nose up, establishing a shaky but stable cruise attitude. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a jackhammer. She had saved them from the immediate plunge, but they were far from safe. She noticed the smell again, acrid, burning. Her eyes were watering. Carbon monoxide, toxic bleed air. If it was a fume event from a blown engine seal leaking synthetic oil fumes into the cockpit air conditioning, she had only minutes, maybe seconds, before she lost consciousness, just like the 2 pilots. She reached to her left, ripped the quick-dawning oxygen mask from its housing, and smashed it over her face. She flipped the toggle to 100% emergency oxygen. The cold, dry air hit her lungs, instantly clearing the brain fog she hadn't even realized was creeping in. She turned to the door. Jessica was staring at her, frozen in terror. "Jessica, get masks on the pilots. Tell the passengers to remain seated. Close this door and lock it." Celine barked, her voice distorted and metallic through the oxygen mask's microphone. The flight attendant nodded mutely and slammed the reinforced door shut. Celine was now completely alone. She was flying a 170,000 pounds commercial airliner carrying 182 people, soaring blindly through a Category 4 winter squall over some of the most unforgiving terrain on planet Earth. She looked at the center console. The radio panel was tuned to the last frequency the crew had been using. She pressed the push-to-talk switch on the yoke. Anchorage Center, this is Alaska. Wait, she glanced at the flight plan clipped to the yoke. Anchorage Center, this is Flight 182. Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. Both pilots are incapacitated. I am a passenger. I have the controls. Static hissed in her ear. For a moment, the vast, icy emptiness of the Alaskan sky felt utterly absolute. Then a voice cracked through the headset. Flight 182, this is Anchorage Center. Say again. Did you say both pilots are incapacitated? The air traffic controller's voice, a man named Greg Harrison, sitting in a dark radar room hundreds of miles away, was taut with disbelief. Affirmative, Center, Celine replied, fighting the yoke as a massive updraft tried to flip the plane. Captain and first officer are unconscious. Suspected toxic fume event in the flight deck. I am on emergency oxygen. I am a United States Air Force F-22 pilot, but I have 0 hours in a Boeing 737. I need a heading, an altitude, and an empty runway. Now, in the Anchorage Tron facility, Greg Harrison stared at his radar scope. The green data block for Flight 182 was flashing emergency red. He looked at the altitude readout. It had plummeted nearly 8,000 feet in less than a minute before leveling off. Copy that, Flight 182, Greg said, his training taking over. He motioned frantically for his supervisor. What is your name, Captain? It's Major Jenkins, Celine Jenkins. Okay, Major Jenkins. We are going to get you on the ground. Be advised, you are currently flying directly over the St. Elias Mountains. Minimum safe altitude in your sector is 22,000 feet. You have severe icing conditions and 0 visibility all the way down to the deck. Celine looked out the window. There was nothing but a wall of violently swirling black clouds and driving snow. Ice was already beginning to accumulate on the windshield wipers. Center, give me vectors to the nearest piece of concrete, Celine demanded, checking the engine thrust levers. Major, the weather at Anchorage is below minimums. Whiteout conditions. Fairbanks is closed due to a blizzard. The only runway within your fuel range that isn't completely socked in is a military strip, Illendorf Air Force Base, but it's surrounded by mountains, and you'll have to fly a manual approach. Celine swallowed hard. She knew Elmendorf. She knew the treacherous mountain passes that guarded it. In a highly maneuverable fighter jet, with terrain following radar, it was a difficult approach. In a heavy, sluggish, icing up 737 with no co-pilot and alarms blaring. It was borderline suicidal. Understood. Center. Celine breathed into the mask. Vector me to Illendorf. Let's go home. The Boeing 737 was fighting her. Every gust of the Alaskan winter squall battered the fuselage, threatening to flip the 170,000 pounds aircraft on its back. In her F-22 Raptor, Major Celine Jenkins relied on fly-by-wire computers that interpreted her microscopic wrist inputs and instantly translated them into impossibly crisp maneuvers. The Boeing was a different beast entirely, a heavy hydromechanical lumbering giant that required raw physical strength to keep level. The acrid smell of burning oil still lingered in the cockpit, though the emergency oxygen mask fed her cold, life-saving air. She kept the mask strapped tight to her face, glancing at the engine instruments. The left engine's oil pressure was fluctuating wildly. The fume event hadn't just incapacitated the pilots. It was a symptom of a catastrophic mechanical failure, slowly tearing the Pratt & Whitney engine apart. Flight 182, Anchorage Center. I have Captain Richard Hayes on the frequency. He's a chief pilot and check airman for the 737 fleet. He is going to talk you down. Greg Harrison's voice was a lifeline in the chaotic shrieking noise of the flight deck. A new voice crackled over the radio, deep, calm, and unmistakably authoritative. Major Jenkins, this is Captain Hayes. I understand you drive fighters for a living. I need you to forget everything you know about yanking and banking. This aircraft is a heavy school bus on ice. Small, deliberate inputs. Do you copy? Copy that, Captain Hayes. Sane breathed heavily, her biceps burning from wrestling the yoke. I have a master caution for anti-ice and the left engine oil pressure is dropping. We are picking up heavy rime ice on the leading edges. She feels incredibly sluggish. Turn on the wing and engine anti-ice switches. Overhead panel top right. If that left engine seizes, you're going to experience massive asymmetrical thrust. Your right leg is going to get a heavy workout on that rudder to keep her flying straight. Celine reached up, her gloved fingers scanning the dizzying array of switches on the overhead panel. She found the anti-ice toggles and snapped them down. Suddenly, the intercom chimed. It was Jessica, the lead flight attendant. Celine hit the receiver button on the yoke. "Go ahead, Jessica. Is the cabin secure?" "Celine Major." Jessica's voice was trembling, bordered on absolute hysteria. "Captain Miller is waking up, but he's completely delirious. He's thrashing around, trying to pull the emergency exit handle over the wing. Thomas and another passenger are trying to hold him down, but he's incredibly strong. He thinks the plane is on fire on the tarmac." Hypoxia. The lack of oxygen had severely scrambled the captain's brain. He was operating purely on a terrifying primal fight-or-flight response. "Do not let him near those doors, Jessica. Restrain him with the zip ties in the security kit if you have to sit on him, whatever it takes. If he blows a door at this altitude, it will explosively decompress the aircraft and tear the tail off. Do you understand?" "Yes, yes, we're strapping him down now." A loud crash echoed through the intercom, followed by shouting. The line went dead. Sellett's heart hammered against her ribs. She couldn't help them. She couldn't leave the seat. Bang! A sound like a cannon shot violently rocked the aircraft. The entire fuselage shuddered so hard Sellen's teeth clicked together. The aircraft violently yarded to the left, the nose dropping aggressively. Beep, beep, beep. Amber and red lights illuminated across the center console. "Mayday, center, I just lost the left engine. Uncontained failure or compressor stall thrust is gone." Sellen shouted immediately, stomping her right boot down hard on the rudder pedal to counteract the sudden massive drag on the left side. The physical effort required to keep the nose pointed forward was agonizing. Her leg muscles screamed in protest. "Major, step on the live engine," Captain Hayes commanded, his voice rising in urgency. "Right rudder, heavy right rudder, pitch down to maintain airspeed. If you get too slow with one engine, you will enter a spin you cannot recover from." Sellen shoved the yoke forward, sacrificing precious altitude to gain speed. The airspeed indicator ticked up from a terrifying 180 knots back to 230 knots. They were descending through 18,000 feet, plunging straight into the treacherous Chugach mountain range that surrounded Elmenorf Air Force Base. Ice pelted the windshield with the ferocity of a machine gun barrage. She was flying entirely on instruments, completely blind in the freezing, churning blackness. "Flight 182. You are 12 miles from the outer marker for runway 06 at Ellendorf." Greg Harrison interjected from ATC. "Be advised, weather at the base has deteriorated. Visibility is 1/4 mile in blowing snow. You will not see the runway until you are practically on top of it." Celine swallowed hard. A 1/4 mile visibility approach on a single engine flown manually by someone who had never landed this airframe. It was a mathematical impossibility. "Captain Hayes," Celine said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. The combat pilot in her had fully taken over. The panic was gone, replaced by a cold, crystalline focus. "Walk me through configuring this heavy bird for a single-engine landing. I need flap speeds and gear-up timing." "Okay, Celine, listen to me closely," Captain Hayes said. The radio static seemed to deepen, isolating them in a digital bubble. "We are going to use flaps 15 for a single-engine approach. Any more drag in that right engine won't have the power to keep you in the air. You're going to come in hot, around 155 knots. Copy. Flaps 15V Ref 5. Do not drop the landing gear until you capture the glide slope. The gear creates massive drag. If you drop it too early, you'll fall out of the sky, short of the runway. You'll be threading the needle between Mount Susna to your west and the Chugach foothills to your east. You cannot deviate from the localizer heading." Celine's eyes locked onto the primary flight display. The pink diamonds, representing the runway's localizer and glide slope, were dancing wildly due to the turbulent winds. She had to keep those diamonds perfectly centered, using nothing but her own battered arms and legs. Descending through 10,000 feet, Celine called out. The turbulence intensified. The aircraft felt like it was driving over massive invisible cobblestones. Overhead bins in the cabin were popping open, showering passengers with luggage. The sound of wind shear tearing over the fuselage was a continuous deafening roar. "And the speed brakes, set auto brakes to max," Hayes instructed. "When you touch down, you're not going to have left engine thrust reverses. The plane is going to want to pull violently to the right when you brake. You have to steer with your feet, speed brakes armed, auto brakes max." They hit 5,000 feet. The temperature in the cockpit had dropped to near freezing. Celine could see her own breath pluming beneath the edges of her oxygen mask. "Tulip." The mechanical voice of the ground proximity warning system suddenly screamed through the cockpit, accompanied by a blaring klaxon. The radar altimeter had painted the jagged peak of a mountain sliding terrifyingly close beneath their belly. "I have a GPWS terrain warning," Celine yelled. "Hold your descent," Greg Harrison shouted from ATC. "You have a mountain ridge 3 miles ahead. Elevation 3,400. Hold at 4,000. Celine pulled back on the heavy yoke, the right engine whining in protest as it tried to haul the massive aircraft upward. The stall warning shaker suddenly activated, the yoke violently vibrating in her hands, warning her the wings were losing lift. She was caught in a lethal trap: pull up to clear the mountain and risk stalling, or nose down to maintain speed and risk impacting the granite ridge. She held the yoke in a vice grip, dancing on the absolute edge of the aerodynamic stall. The aircraft shuddered, groaning like a dying animal. "Tan pull up." The altimeter read 3,600, 3,500. They were skimming the invisible peak by a matter of feet. Then the GPWS alarm abruptly silenced. They had cleared the ridge. "I'm clear, intercepting the glide slope now," Celine gasped, sweat pouring down her face despite the freezing cold. "Drop the gear, Major. You are 3 miles out," Hayes ordered. Celine grabbed the heavy wheel-shaped landing gear lever and yanked it down. A loud hydraulic thud echoed through the floorboards as the massive main gear deployed, locking into place. The drag hit the aircraft instantly, forcing Celine to push the right throttle lever forward to compensate. 1,000 feet, Celine called. Still nothing but swirling hypnotic whiteout outside the window. 500 feet. The wind-shear alarms began shrieking. Wind-shear, wind-shear, wind-shear. The plane was being shoved sideways by a massive 50-knot crosswind. Celine had to cross control, banking the wings to the right while shoving the rudder to the left, just to keep the nose pointed at the invisible runway. 200 feet. Where is it? Where is the runway? Minimums, the automated voice called out. By regulation, if she couldn't see the runway environment at this exact second, she had to execute a missed approach, throttle up, and climb back into the deadly ice storm. But with a blown engine and low fuel, a go-round was a death sentence. She had to land now. 50. Suddenly, the swirling snow broke through the violently beating windshield wipers. The blazing high-intensity strobe lights of Ellendorf's runway 06 materialized out of the gloom. They were terrifyingly close, flashing rapidly, guiding her into the concrete slab. But she wasn't lined up. The crosswind had blown the heavy 73,750 feet to the left of the center line. 40. Celine violently wrenched the heavy yoke to the right, kicking the rudder. The massive aircraft banked sharply, realigning with the center line just feet above the ground. 30-20-10. Celine hauled back on the yoke, flaring the nose. The right main landing gear slammed onto the grooved concrete with bone-jarring force. A split second later, the left gear touched down. Screech. The speed brakes deployed automatically. Celine slammed the right thrust lever into max reverse. The aircraft fishtailed violently, the asymmetric braking and thrust threatening to spin the 737 right off the runway into the snowbanks. "Stay on the center line. Stay on it." Celine screamed to herself, her boots dancing wildly on the rudder pedals, fighting the immense lateral forces. The heavy aircraft roared, tires smoking, engines screaming in reverse, fighting the momentum of 170,000 pounds of metal, traveling at 160 miles per hour on an icy runway. Slowly, agonizingly, the numbers on the airspeed indicator began to drop. The violent shaking subsided. The roar of the engine dialed down to a heavy whine. The Boeing 737 rolled to a complete shuddering halt, precisely in the center of the runway. Silence, heavy and absolute, crashed down inside the cockpit. The only sound was the ticking of cooling metal and Celine's own ragged, frantic breathing. Outside the frosted window, the flashing red and blue lights of half a dozen military fire trucks were already emerging through the blizzard surrounding the aircraft. Celine slowly released her white-knuckled grip on the yoke. Her arms were shaking so violently she could barely reach up to pull the engine cutoff switches. She unstrapped her oxygen mask, letting it fall to the floor. The cockpit door burst open. Jessica stood there, tears streaming down her face, the passenger cabin behind her erupting into deafening cheers, applause, and uncontrollable sobbing. Thomas was standing over the restrained, now conscious Captain Miller, giving Celine a silent, struck salute. Celine sank back into the captain's chair, staring blankly at the runway lights cutting through the Alaskan dark. She was a combat pilot who had just fought the greatest dogfight of her life, and she hadn't fired a single shot. In the ultimate test of human endurance, Major Celine Jenkins saved 182 lives by stepping into the unknown when terror paralyzed the skies. Her story proves that true heroes don't just wear capes. Sometimes they sit in seat 3D, waiting for the moment they are needed most. If this incredible true story of survival, aviation skill, and raw courage kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more breathtaking survival stories.